September 3rd, 1945, Yokosuka Naval Base, Japan. At 07:42 a.m., the sharp clatter of military boots echoed against the damp concrete of the Yokosuka docks. Corporal James Carter, sweat beading under the heat of his woolen uniform, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, gripping his rifle tighter. His squad had just arrived to oversee the final handover of prisoners. He wasn't expecting the women, Japanese nurses, their uniforms stained, their faces hollow from days of uncertainty. Aiko Sato stood among them, her back stiff, eyes focused on the ground. The sweat on her brow wasn't from the heat. It was the cold dread that crawled beneath her skin. For months, the war had torn apart her nation, and now, in the quiet aftermath, she was a prisoner. The sound of a rifle butt tapping against the concrete pulled her from her thoughts. It was the first time she had seen a black American soldier. The shock in her chest was unmistakable. Yokosuka was an industrial port city, its once vibrant skyline now a skeletal reflection of its former glory. Corporal James Carter stood among his squad on the edge of the docks, the morning air thick with salt and diesel fumes. The Japanese civilians were lined up in rows, their faces ghostly pale under the bright morning sun. Women, mostly nurses, were separated from the men by chain-link barriers hastily erected overnight. The orders had been simple enough: secure the area and ensure no escape attempts. What Carter wasn't prepared for was the overwhelming sight of young women in uniform, some appearing no older than 18, their eyes distant and vacant. He caught sight of one nurse in particular. Her features were sharp, defined by high cheekbones and a straight nose, but her posture spoke only of defeat. Her name, as he would soon learn from the intake roster, was Aiko Sato. The way her eyes refused to meet his unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He wasn't sure why, but there was something about the quiet sorrow in her gaze that stuck with him through his first shift. Aiko had always been taught that honor was the core of her identity. As a nurse serving the Imperial Japanese Navy, she was part of the machinery of war, a cog in a system that valued duty above individual existence, but the quiet hum of Japan's surrender echoed louder than any notion of honor she had known. In the distance, the sound of heavy trucks rumbled down the demolished streets. The American forces were processing prisoners methodically, tagging, interrogating, preparing for transport to larger facilities inland. Carter glanced down at his radio. Static buzzed intermittently, orders filtering through in broken fragments. His squad leader's voice crackled. "Keep them in formation. No unauthorized movement." Aiko stiffened when she saw the soldiers approaching. Their dark skins stood out sharply against the backdrop of her monochrome world. She had seen photographs before, had heard whispered stories, but never this close. Her heart clenched with a confusion of fear and curiosity. She wasn't sure if she was more terrified of these foreign soldiers or of the sense of betrayal she felt toward her defeated nation. Carter, meanwhile, battled his own internal conflict. Though he had spent months island hopping across the Pacific, the reality of occupying Japan felt fundamentally different. These weren't armed combatants. They were civilians, exhausted, broken, and entirely at his mercy. But something flickered in his chest when he locked eyes with Aiko across the concrete yard. For just a moment, the weight of his uniform seemed to fade into insignificance. The air inside the detention hall was thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken tension. Carter's boots scuffed against the concrete floor as he took up his assigned post near the main entrance. He wasn't sure what his orders really meant anymore. Every day felt identical. Keep the prisoners orderly, make sure no one attempts escape, maintain discipline, but today was different somehow. Today something had shifted in the atmosphere. It was as if the silent women gathered in small clusters had become living reflections of the war itself, a conflict that had torn apart everything, even the people who had fought in it. Aiko sat silently in the far corner of the large room, her fingers absently tracing the edge of a worn medical pamphlet, the only personal item the guards had allowed her to retain. Her colleagues sat beside her, shoulders touching, huddled together for warmth and psychological safety. Their eyes were vacant, staring at nothing in particular. They had witnessed too much suffering in too short a time. When the American guards entered for their routine inspection, the atmosphere transformed immediately. The tension in the room became almost tactile, pressing against everyone present. But it was Carter's presence that seemed most foreign. He was the first black soldier most of these women had encountered since the war began. His very existence contradicted the racial narrative they had been taught, the propaganda that had painted certain peoples as inferior, as threats. Yet Aiko found she couldn't summon the same reflexive fear she felt toward some of the other guards. She had overheard whispered conversations about these particular soldiers. Some prisoners spoke of unexpected acts of compassion during the brutal campaigns across the Pacific Islands, but still, seeing one of them in person, feeling the gravity of that encounter, struck her differently than she'd anticipated. His face appeared softer somehow, more vulnerable than the hardened expressions worn by other occupying forces. Her thoughts were interrupted abruptly by the sound of Carter's voice cutting through the murmuring. "Stay in your designated areas. No unauthorized movement," he announced to the room, his tone firm, but not unnecessarily harsh. Aiko's heart skipped a beat. She realized with sudden clarity that he had been looking directly at her when he spoke. Their eyes had met for just a fraction of a second before she quickly looked away, heat rising in her cheeks. As the days accumulated, the reality of captivity settled over them like a heavy blanket. The nurses were periodically moved from one temporary holding facility to another, each transfer feeling more impersonal than the last. The psychological weight of the occupation hung heavy in the stale air of each new location. Yet it was during the second week of their internment that Carter began noticing something, an observation that unsettled him more than the oppressive nature of the occupation itself could explain. Aiko had started communicating with him, not through words exactly, but through small, fleeting glances that seemed weighted with meaning. She would look at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, as though trying to convey something without the risk of actual speech. At first, Carter dismissed it as his imagination, a projection of his own isolation. But soon the pattern became impossible to ignore or rationalize away. One evening, as the sun cast long orange shadows across the detention yard, Aiko sat alone on a wooden bench near the fence. Carter found himself approaching her, his boots crunching deliberately against the gravel path, the sound somehow too loud in the comparative stillness of dusk. He knew he was stepping outside his prescribed role, but something compelled him forward anyway. "You're the nurse from the naval base, correct?" His voice came out lower than intended, and there was an unspoken question buried beneath his words. Aiko looked up slowly, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes betraying a flicker of something else. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling only slightly despite her effort at composure. "I was." Carter nodded, suddenly unsure what to say next. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable yet somehow not hostile. Then, as if guided by an impulse he didn't fully understand, he took another step forward. He didn't want to stand as her guard, didn't want to embody her captor. Yet wasn't that precisely his assigned role in this situation? "I don't know what to do with you," he confessed quietly, the words escaping before his better judgment could intercept them. Aiko didn't answer immediately. She studied him carefully, trying to decipher the shift in dynamics between them. The tension felt thick with unspoken possibilities, but there was something fragile emerging in the way they interacted. She finally lowered her eyes. "You do what you must," she said simply. Carter stood there motionless, his mind racing through contradictory thoughts and feelings. He wasn't certain if he was speaking to her as a prisoner or as a human being. But then something inside him shifted, some internal barrier cracking. "I won't let anything happen to you," he whispered. Aiko glanced up sharply, her heart pounding unexpectedly hard. The simplicity of his words and the genuine gentleness in his tone caught her completely off guard. She wasn't sure if she could afford to trust him, but for the first time since her capture, she felt the tiniest sliver of something that might have been hope. Weeks accumulated slowly, and as the war's official conclusion drew nearer, the occupying forces gradually assumed new responsibilities, rebuilding infrastructure, establishing provisional governance systems, remaking the social order. Yet for Aiko and the other detained nurses, there existed nothing but the endless monotony of waiting. The nurses continued performing limited medical duties under the constant supervision of American soldiers, including the black troops from Carter's unit. They were adequately fed, kept organized, but always treated with a certain prescribed distance that felt institutional rather than personal. Aiko's interactions with Carter had grown incrementally more frequent over time. He rarely spoke to her at length, but his presence had become a constant she unconsciously anticipated. It manifested in subtle ways, how he positioned himself during yard time, never invasively close, but never so distant as to seem deliberately avoidant, always vigilant, always somehow present. She found herself wondering if he thought about her the way she increasingly found herself thinking about him. Carter, for his part, was plagued by questions he couldn't voice to his fellow soldiers. He had heard various stories about the nurses who had served in Japan's military medical facilities throughout the Pacific Theater. Some men spoke of them with grudging professional respect, others with lingering wartime prejudice and suspicion. But there was no denying the distinctly human connection he was beginning to feel, despite every regulation and social prohibition against it. One night, during his patrol rounds, he discovered Aiko, sitting alone near the perimeter fence, staring out at the moonlit ocean that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Her face appeared pale in the silver light, her eyes distant and unfocused. He felt a strong urge to approach her, to say something meaningful, but caution held him back momentarily. For all his growing curiosity and confused feelings, he remained uncertain whether he should cross that increasingly blurred boundary, but ultimately he couldn't stop himself. "You miss your country, don't you?" he asked quietly, his voice barely carrying over the sound of waves against distant rocks. Aiko turned toward him, her gaze soft but carrying an unmistakable resignation. "More than you could possibly imagine," she replied, her words weighted with accumulated loss. Their eyes locked for a sustained moment, and Carter felt something fundamental stir within him. He had always believed firmly in the righteousness of his mission, the historical justice underlying the occupation. But now, standing in this quiet evening moment, he felt the crushing weight of it all. He wasn't merely an occupier, enforcing military order. He was a human being standing in the devastated ruins of someone else's entire world. The following days brought an unsettling quiet that seemed heavier than the previous tension. The prisoners appeared less active overall, their movements more mechanical, and the presence of the black American soldiers had transformed from shocking novelty into routine reality. For Carter, the constant vigilance was beginning to wear through his psychological defenses. He had grown accustomed to the established power dynamics, the clear-cut orders, the rigid boundaries between guard and guarded. But something in Aiko's demeanor had begun chipping away at his certainty about everything. Her sadness wasn't a security threat. It was a reflection of shared human experience, a war that had torn through both of their lives in ways neither could yet fully comprehend or articulate. One night, after an exhaustingly long day of standing guard duty, Carter sat alone in the barracks, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing monotonously overhead. His mind helplessly replayed images of Aiko, particularly the recurring scene of her sitting by that window, gazing out at the vast expanse of ocean. Something about the way she looked at that horizon made him desperately want to understand what she was thinking, what internal landscape she was navigating. He pulled out his worn notebook and began to write. His thoughts emerged fragmented and disjointed, but the ink gave them tangible shape. Guilt, he wrote, compassion, hope, confusion, duty. It felt like a strange and contradictory mixture, but somehow it felt accurate. Something in his chest physically tightened as he read back what he had written. He wasn't sure anymore if it was the burden of his military duty or the weight of their shared humanity pressing down on him. Either way, he recognized this truth. Aiko had become something more than a prisoner to him. She had become a person, fully real and impossibly complicated. Across the darkened camp, Aiko lay awake on her small cot, the thin institutional blanket twisted uncomfortably around her legs. She had been confined here for nearly a full month now, and though she had adapted to the basic rhythms of captivity, her mind continued racing with intrusive memories, the desperate cries of wounded soldiers, the constant sound of artillery fire, the burning buildings collapsing into rubble. These images haunted her sleeping and waking hours, but increasingly it was Carter's face that lingered longest in her thoughts. The way he had spoken to her with unexpected tenderness. It felt wrong given their circumstances, but it also felt like the only lifeline she had to something resembling human connection. Aiko sat in the yard with several of her fellow nurses, their heads bent low as they conversed in hushed, cautious voices. The men who guarded them typically remained distant, their eyes cold and professionally detached. But Carter's presence felt consistently different. When he was nearby during his rotation, his gaze appeared softer somehow. His overall manner suggested not rigid military authority, but quiet, careful observation of actual human beings. She couldn't fully understand it, but something about the way he looked at her made her chest physically tighten. There were specific moments when their eyes would unexpectedly meet across the yard, and it felt as if the entire chaotic world had momentarily stopped rotating. It wasn't fear she detected in his eyes during those brief exchanges. It was something else entirely, something more fundamentally human, a recognition, a connection neither of them had permission to acknowledge, but these moments remained frustratingly fleeting. As Carter walked past the yard one afternoon, he noticed Aiko sitting alone on a bench, while the other nurses gathered in small groups nearby. Her face, usually so carefully composed and controlled, appeared relaxed now, almost peaceful, as if she had temporarily surrendered to the moment rather than fighting against her circumstances. He didn't consciously decide to approach her, but his feet carried him in her direction anyway, his boots clicking rhythmically against the pavement. "Aiko," he said simply, stopping just in front of her position. She looked up at him, her dark eyes meeting his directly. "Yes?" The silence between them stretched out, thick and uncomfortable, yet somehow not hostile. He opened his mouth, intending to speak, but the appropriate words refused to materialize. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement that contained more meaning than language could have conveyed. It felt as if, in that suspended moment, the immense weight of the occupation, the war, the captivity, the forced separation of victor and vanquished, had temporarily melted away, leaving only two people. "Do you want to talk?" Carter heard himself asking, surprising even himself with the directness of the question and the vulnerability it implied. Aiko hesitated, various considerations flashing across her expression. Then she nodded slowly, deliberately. "Yes," she said quietly. "I would like that." The war had systematically shattered everything. The Japanese Empire, once proud and powerful beyond measure, now lay in comprehensive ruins. But it wasn't merely the physical destruction that weighed most heavily on Aiko. It was the complete collapse of the ideals and beliefs she had held so tightly for her entire life. As a military nurse, she had witnessed life in its most fragile, vulnerable form. But now, in the aftermath of total defeat, she was seeing existence in its most fundamentally broken state. And it wasn't just the physical wounds visible on the people around her. It was the deeper moral destruction, the profound sense that everything she had known and believed had been turned completely inside out. As she spoke with Carter in the small, dimly lit corner of the courtyard, she couldn't help wondering about him as an individual. How could he have emerged from a place so impossibly far away? From a country so radically different, a world so alien to her experience? Yet here they were, both of them prisoners in different ways to the aftermath of war, bound together by inexplicable fate and circumstance. Carter listened carefully, his gaze fixed on her face. He could hear the accumulated pain in her voice, the quiet despair that had become the unmistakable hallmark of their time together. And yet, there was something more threading through her words, something fragile in the way she spoke, like she was tentatively reaching out, trying to connect with him in a way that neither of them could fully grasp or articulate clearly. She told him about the nursing corps, about the dedicated women who had worked tirelessly under impossible conditions to tend to wounded soldiers, about the collective dreams of a nation that now lay in ashes and rubble. But as she spoke with increasing openness, Carter realized he was hearing more than just the factual story of a military nurse. He was hearing the deeply personal story of a woman who had been systematically broken by war, just as he had been broken in his own different way. And for the first time since arriving in Japan, he truly understood the shared nature of their experience, despite standing on opposite sides of history. Aiko's conversations with Carter continued over the following weeks, but the emotional weight of each exchange seemed to grow progressively heavier. There were moments when the words flowed with surprising ease, when they spoke tentatively of their lives before the war erupted, of their families now separated by circumstances, of their dreams that felt increasingly impossible. But there were also extended moments of profound silence, when neither of them possessed adequate language for what they were experiencing or feeling. It was during one of these weighted silences that Carter began noticing something significant, a gradual shift in the way his fellow soldiers treated the detained women. The harsh tension that had been so prevalent during the early days of the occupation was slowly dissipating. The guards, once rigidly harsh and deliberately distant, were becoming incrementally more compassionate in small, almost imperceptible ways. But it wasn't only the soldiers who had changed fundamentally. Aiko herself had begun opening up emotionally. She wasn't the same frightened woman who had first arrived at Yokosuka weeks ago, stiff with paralyzing fear and crushing uncertainty. She had begun trusting Carter, or at least she had begun trusting in the fragile possibility of trust between enemies who were discovering their shared humanity. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the entire base, Aiko and Carter stood together by the perimeter fence. The vast ocean stretched out endlessly before them, its surface shimmering beautifully under the fading golden light. Small waves caught the sun, creating countless points of reflected brilliance. "It's beautiful," Aiko whispered, her voice soft and almost reverent. Carter nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the distant horizon where sea met sky. "Yeah," he said quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected depth of feeling. "It really is." For one suspended moment, there existed no war, no military occupation, no victor or vanquished, just two human beings standing together in the quiet, complicated aftermath of everything that had come before. The weight of history pressed down on them, but in that single moment, it felt bearable because it was shared. The turning point arrived suddenly when new orders came down from higher command. The American forces were systematically tightening their grip on all remaining Japanese civilian prisoners throughout the occupation zone. The officers overseeing the occupation wanted more than mere compliance from the defeated population. They wanted absolute, demonstrable control that would prevent any possibility of organized resistance. Carter's squad received specific tasking: oversee the transfer of select prisoners to a more secure holding facility located inland. It was framed as a routine logistical operation, but for Carter the weight of these orders felt fundamentally different. Aiko was among the group selected to be moved to the new facility. For weeks they had existed in a strange, tentative peace within the boundaries of the camp, a fragile equilibrium that was now being deliberately torn apart by military bureaucracy. "I don't want to go," Aiko said when she learned of the transfer, her voice trembling despite her attempt at composure. Carter's heart sank with a physical sensation of falling. "You don't have a choice," he said, the words tasting bitter even as he spoke them, but Aiko didn't move from where she stood. Her body remained rigid, her hands clenched at her sides. For a moment Carter thought she might emotionally break down completely, but instead she slowly turned to face him directly, her eyes remarkably steady despite the tears gathering at their edges. "I don't want to be a prisoner anymore," she said quietly but clearly. "But I am, and I will always be, won't I?" Carter swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly. He couldn't fully understand or name what he was feeling. An overwhelming mixture of rage at the circumstances, guilt for his role in them, and a compassion that violated every regulation. He had never been trained to feel emotional connection to his enemies, but now it seemed utterly impossible to ignore what had developed between them. "Get her moving, Corporal," a harsh voice barked from somewhere behind him. Carter clenched his fists tightly, his jaw rigid with tension. He turned partially to face the officer issuing the command, but something made him stop mid-motion. Aiko's eyes were locked intensely on his, pleading silently for something he wasn't certain he could provide. And in that crystallized moment of decision, he made his choice. He wouldn't let her go without trying something. The consequences of Carter's act of defiance arrived swiftly and predictably. He was summoned to the commanding officer's office within the hour, where he stood rigidly at attention, his chest tight with apprehension about what punishment awaited him. "You disobeyed a direct order, Corporal," the officer stated coldly, his voice carrying no inflection whatsoever. Carter's heart pounded violently in his chest. "Sir, I couldn't let her go like that." The officer stared at him for what felt like an eternity, his weathered face utterly unreadable. Finally, he released a long, weary sigh. "You've developed a soft spot for her, haven't you?" Carter didn't respond verbally. His silence was answer enough. "Listen carefully, Carter," the officer continued, leaning forward slightly. "I understand that this occupation puts us in difficult positions. I understand that these people aren't our enemies anymore. Not really. But we have orders. We have a structure to maintain. You're a good soldier, and I don't want to see you throw away your career over one Japanese nurse." Carter remained standing at attention, his fists clenched so tightly at his sides that his fingernails dug into his palms. "Don't let it happen again," the officer said finally, his voice dropping lower. "We're here to maintain order and facilitate reconstruction, not to form personal attachments. Do you understand me, Corporal?" "Yes, sir," Carter responded automatically. "Dismissed?" Carter saluted sharply and turned to leave, his mind churning. He didn't know what he had expected from the confrontation, but this strange mixture of reprimand and understanding, wasn't it? As he walked back across the base, he realized that his small act of defiance had bought Aiko perhaps one more day, maybe two, but it hadn't changed anything fundamental. She would still be transferred, they would still be separated, and he would return to being simply another soldier enforcing the occupation. But for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, even that small delay felt meaningful. It felt like the only moral choice available to him within an immoral situation. He had stood up for her humanity, even knowing it would ultimately change nothing about the grinding machinery of military bureaucracy. And somehow that mattered. It had to matter. As the days passed following his reprimand, Carter found himself emotionally withdrawing from his duties and his fellow soldiers. He couldn't adequately explain why, even to himself, but he felt broken in ways he hadn't anticipated. The established rules of warfare, the rigid structure of military hierarchy, none of it seemed to make coherent sense anymore. Everything felt arbitrary and cruel. Aiko's departure was now imminent and inevitable. Though Carter had done his best to delay the transfer using every small, bureaucratic excuse he could devise, he knew that her time in this particular camp was definitively coming to an end. The transport trucks were already being prepared. The transfer orders had been finalized. Reality was reasserting itself with implacable force. Their final conversation happened unexpectedly one evening, brief but weighted with everything they couldn't say. Carter found her alone in the yard one last time, standing by the fence and looking out at the darkening ocean. He approached slowly, his footsteps deliberate. "Will you be okay?" he asked, his voice strained with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. Aiko turned to face him, and to his surprise, she smiled softly. It was a sad smile, but genuine. Her eyes appeared tired, but somehow steady, as if she had found some internal reserve of strength. "I'll survive," she said simply. "I always do." Carter wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that she had changed something fundamental in him, that their conversations had mattered more than she could know, that he would carry her memory with him, but the words stuck in his throat, trapped by circumstances and propriety, and the uniform he wore. "Thank you," Aiko said quietly, "for seeing me as a person. Not many did." Carter nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They stood there for a moment longer, two people separated by language and culture and the brutal fact of war, but connected by something more fundamental than any of those barriers. And then the moment passed. An officer called his name from across the yard. Aiko bowed slightly, a gesture of respect and farewell. Carter returned the gesture awkwardly, then turned and walked away. He never saw her again. The occupation period eventually ended, and American soldiers gradually returned home from Japan. Carter was reassigned to a new unit stateside, his time in Yokosuka fading slowly into the category of memory. The war officially concluded, treaties were signed, and the world moved forward into an uncertain peace. But Carter never forgot Aiko or the nurses like her, women who had been caught in the crushing machinery of a conflict they didn't initiate and couldn't control. In the years that followed his discharge from service, he would occasionally find his thoughts drifting back to those weeks after Japan's surrender, to the complicated emotions of that strange time. He thought about the women like Aiko, educated, dedicated professionals who had served their country with honor, only to find themselves prisoners in a world that had fundamentally transformed overnight. He wondered what had become of them, whether they had managed to rebuild their lives in the ruins of their defeated nation. He never attempted to find her. He understood instinctively that their connection had existed only within that specific moment in history, that strange liminal space between war and peace. Trying to recapture or continue it would have been impossible, perhaps even inappropriate. They had been two people thrown together by circumstance, finding unexpected humanity in each other during inhumane times. That was enough. It had to be enough. But in the quiet moments of his life, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, or during long drives through empty countryside, he would remember. He would remember her face by moonlight, her quiet dignity despite her circumstances, the way she had looked at the ocean as if it might carry her somewhere else entirely. He would remember the sound of her voice saying, "I'll survive," and he would hope desperately that she had been right. He never spoke of it directly, of Aiko, of the nurses, of the things he had witnessed and felt during those complicated weeks. It wasn't the kind of story his family would have understood, or one that fit neatly into the triumphant narrative of American victory, but it was a part of him nonetheless, and in a way, it always would be. Years later, Carter stood on a street corner in Philadelphia, the weight of age and accumulated experience settling comfortably on his shoulders. He had built a good life for himself, had a family now, children who had grown into adults themselves, grandchildren who climbed on his lap and asked him to tell stories about the war. But he never told them about Yokosuka. He never told them about Aiko. Instead, he told them the sanitized versions, stories of camaraderie with fellow soldiers, of seeing distant places, of the relief and celebration when the war finally ended. These were true stories, but they weren't the whole truth. They were the stories that fit comfortably into family gatherings and holiday dinners, stories that confirmed the narrative everyone wanted to believe about that time in history. But sometimes, late at night, when his wife was asleep beside him, he would lie awake and think. He would think about that ocean, the way it had stretched endlessly before them that evening, reflecting the fading light like a field of scattered diamonds. He would think about the fundamental impossibility of their situation and the undeniable reality of the human connection they had briefly shared despite it. He realized, in those contemplative moments, that the true cost of war wasn't merely counted in the lives lost or the cities destroyed. It was also measured in the lives that were never fully lived, in the connections that could never develop, in the possibilities that had to remain forever unrealized because history and circumstances had placed people on opposite sides of an artificial divide. And he wondered, with a question that had no answer, whether if given the impossible chance to return to that moment, he would have done things differently. Would he have been braver, more defiant? Would he have found a way to truly help her beyond those small gestures? Or had the war, with its absolute categories and its grinding machinery of duty and obedience, already made all the important choices for him before he ever arrived at those docks? He never found an answer that satisfied him, but the question itself remained, a quiet companion through the remaining years of his life, a reminder that some moments echo forward through time in ways we can never fully escape or resolve.